I was standing in the lobby of a luxury coastal resort, clutching an $11,000 bill I could never pay when my son walked out the glass doors without looking back. In that moment, humiliation burned deeper than poverty, and I realized the weekend he called a gift had been a carefully staged betrayal. I thought the worst part was being abandoned with nothing. I was wrong. What waited behind the receptionist's quiet question would unravel my past, expose buried truths, and force me to choose between protecting my child or protecting the truth. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're watching from. We love seeing how our stories bring people together from every corner of the world. Your thoughts and comments are what make this community so special, and we're truly grateful to have you here. If you haven't already, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story filled with drama, resilience, and unexpected twists. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and maybe grab your favorite drink because this is a tale you won't want to miss. Let's get started. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 68 years old, and I live alone in a narrow apartment building in North Charleston, South Carolina, where the paint peels from the railings and the summer air settles heavy against the windows. Every morning begins the same way. I rise before the sun, boil coffee in a dented pot, and rub my stiff hands while the kettle hisses. Years of scrubbing other people's floors and lifting patience heavier than I ever was have left my knuckles swollen and my shoulders permanently sore. Pain has become a quiet companion, one I acknowledge but rarely mention. I spent most of my life caring for others. After my husband died in a refinery accident when Daniel was 6, I took whatever work I could find. I cleaned houses, bathed elderly clients, sat beside hospital beds through long nights, and learned to stretch a dollar until it felt like fabric worn thin. I skipped doctor visits so Daniel could have new textbooks. I worked double shifts so he could join the science club. When the rent rose, I sold my wedding ring and told him it had been misplaced. I never considered those sacrifices heroic. They were simply the cost of loving a child. Daniel grew up thin and serious, wearing secondhand sneakers and carrying dreams bigger than our circumstances. I walked him to school through heat and rain because we could not afford the bus. At night, we shared canned soup and did homework at the kitchen table. He studied hard, earned scholarships, and eventually graduated from college with honors. Watching him cross that stage remains the proudest moment of my life. Success, however, carried him away. After he accepted a position as a financial officer with a coastal real estate firm, his visits became infrequent. Holidays turned into brief phone calls, then into text messages that arrived hours late. I told neighbors he was busy building a future. I defended him even when the silence lingered too long. His childhood photographs remain on my wall, a quiet reassurance that the boy who once clung to my hand still existed somewhere inside the man. Last Tuesday evening, while I was folding laundry at the kitchen table, my phone rang. Daniel's name glowed on the screen. When I answered, his voice sounded younger, almost like the boy who used to ask for bedtime stories. He told me he wanted to take me away for the weekend, to thank me for everything I had done. He said I deserved to rest somewhere beautiful. After the call ended, I sat in silence. Tears came without warning, sliding down my cheeks and onto the clean shirts in my lap. I wondered if the years of sacrifice had finally been seen. On Friday afternoon, a black luxury sedan pulled up outside my building. Daniel stepped out wearing tailored clothes and expensive sunglasses. His wife, Vanessa, emerged from the passenger seat, elegant and composed, her smile polite but distant. I worried my sensible shoes and faded dress might embarrass them, yet Daniel kissed my cheek and took my suitcase as if no distance had ever existed. As we drove toward the coast, the city thinned into marshland and open sky. Daniel asked questions about my father, Samuel Whitaker, focusing on land he once owned and disputes I barely remembered. I assumed he was curious about family history, but a faint unease stirred beneath my gratitude. I watched the road unwind ahead of us and allowed myself to hope this journey might restore something we had lost. Still, hope, like age, carries its own quiet fragility. If you're still watching and feel something isn't right about that perfect weekend, comment one below so I know you're here. Now, let's move into what really started to unravel. The resort rose from the edge of the Atlantic like something imagined rather than built. White walls gleamed against the blue horizon, and long windows reflected the slow roll of the ocean beyond. As Daniel steered the car through a curved drive lined with palms and trimmed hedges, I felt my chest tighten with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Places like this belong to glossy travel magazines and television commercials, not to women who measured grocery money in folded coupons. When we stepped inside the lobby, cool air brushed my face, carrying the faint scent of salt and polished wood. The marble floor shone so brightly it reflected the chandeliers above like captured sunlight. Somewhere, a piano played softly, the notes floating across the room in a way that made conversation feel unnecessary. I paused just inside the entrance, suddenly aware of my sensible shoes and the careful stitching on my old handbag. Daniel touched my elbow and guided me forward, telling me to relax, that I belonged here as much as anyone. His voice was gentle, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe him. The receptionist greeted us with practiced warmth, and no one stared or whispered. Still, I felt as if I had stepped into a life meant for someone else. The suite overlooked the ocean. Pale curtains drifted in the breeze from the balcony door, and sunlight spilled across the polished floors. Beyond the glass, dunes rolled toward a wide band of blue water that seemed to stretch forever. I moved slowly through the room, running my fingers along the back of a chair, touching the smooth surface of the dresser, testing the softness of the towels in the bathroom as though they might dissolve in my hands. Gratitude swelled in my chest so suddenly it made my throat ache. Vanessa stood near the window, elegant and composed, her reflection merging with the bright horizon. She complimented the view and asked if I was comfortable, her voice courteous but distant, like a receptionist rather than family. She watched me in a way I could not quite interpret, as if measuring my reactions. I told myself the discomfort was my own insecurity rising to the surface. That evening we dined at a restaurant overlooking the water. Candlelight flickered against glass walls while waves broke in a steady rhythm below. Daniel ordered seafood I could not pronounce and poured wine into my glass with careful attention. He raised it in a quiet toast, thanking me for the years I worked to give him a future. The words settled over me like warmth after a long winter. I felt seen in a way I had not felt in decades. Yet beneath the tenderness, something unsettled stirred. Daniel began asking about my father, Samuel Whitaker, and the land he once owned near the coast. His questions grew specific, touching on property boundaries, old disputes, and whether any documents remained. I answered as best I could, though I had long ago set aside those memories. Vanessa listened without interruption, her gaze steady and intent. Late that night, I woke and noticed the balcony door slightly open. Daniel's voice drifted through the curtain, low and controlled. I caught fragments of words carried by the wind: transfer, shares, legal heir, before the ocean swallowed the rest. I told myself he was discussing work, nothing more. By morning, the sky was a clear, forgiving blue. At breakfast, Daniel checked his phone frequently, while Vanessa watched me with a polite smile that lingered too long. Around us, guests moved with the easy confidence of people accustomed to comfort. I felt like an imposter who had wandered into the wrong life. Before leaving the table, Daniel said we would meet in the lobby at 11 to check out together. His tone was casual, yet he avoided my eyes. Vanessa's smile remained fixed, as if waiting for something to unfold. Back in the suite, I packed slowly. On the balcony, I watched waves collapse against the shore and felt gratitude and unease settle side by side within me. Something beneath this perfect weekend had shifted. I could not name it, but it followed me like a shadow I could not step away from. If that quiet question from the receptionist gave you chills, comment 2 below to stay with me. What she revealed next changed everything. I arrived in the lobby a few minutes before 11, pulling my small suitcase behind me. The same marble floors that had seemed magical 2 days earlier now echoed with the hurried rhythm of departures. Luggage wheels rattled, doors opened and closed, and voices overlapped in a restless current of movement. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, turning the polished floor into a mirror that reflected travelers moving in every direction. I paused near a column, absorbing the scene, still holding the quiet gratitude I carried from the weekend. Daniel and Vanessa stood near the reception desk, speaking with a clerk. Their posture was relaxed, almost casual, as though they had done this 100 times. When Daniel noticed me, he stepped forward with a quick smile and wrapped his arms around me in a brief embrace. His cheek brushed mine, but he pulled away before I could hold him. "Thanks for the weekend, Mom," he said softly. Before I could respond, he placed a folded paper into my hand. His expression remained pleasant, almost distant, as if we were exchanging receipts rather than affection. Then he turned toward the glass doors. Vanessa followed, adjusting the strap of her handbag as though nothing unusual had happened. I stood there, waiting for them to look back. They did not. They walked through the doors and into the bright morning light, their reflection sliding across the glass before disappearing entirely. Through the window, I watched them enter a waiting car. The vehicle eased into traffic and was gone within seconds. Only then did I look down at the paper in my hand. My fingers trembled as I unfolded it. Rows of numbers blurred together until my eyes focused on the total printed at the bottom. $14,860. The digits pulsed on the page, refusing to settle into reality. That amount was more than I earned in a year. My knees weakened, and I reached for the counter to steady myself. The lobby noise receded into a distant hum, like sound heard underwater. "Ma'am, will you be paying with cash or card?" the receptionist asked in a courteous tone. Her question drifted toward me slowly, as if carried on a delayed echo. I opened my mouth, but nothing emerged. Around me, guests continued their departures. A young couple laughed near the fountain. A businessman spoke loudly into his phone. Life moved forward while mine seemed suspended in place. I cannot," I managed to whisper. The receptionist's expression remained professional, but concern softened her eyes. Her fingers paused above the keyboard. "If there is a problem, I can contact the manager," she said gently. The word problem felt absurdly small against the abyss opening beneath my feet. Daniel knew my income. He knew my savings. He knew there was no possible way I could pay this bill. The realization spread through my chest like cold water. Heat rose into my face as I became aware of people glancing toward me, then quickly looking away. I pressed my lips together, willing my tears to remain contained. I would not collapse in front of strangers. The receptionist shifted uneasily, unsure how to proceed. I imagined security, questions, public humiliation, perhaps even police involvement. My breathing grew shallow, each inhale catching in my throat. Then I heard slow footsteps approaching across the marble floor. An older woman emerged from behind the desk area, her gray hair neatly pinned and her uniform slightly different from the others. She studied my face with an intensity that made me feel suddenly exposed, as if she were searching through decades of memory. She stepped closer, her eyes narrowing with recognition. "Are you the daughter of Samuel Whitaker?" she asked quietly. The name struck me like a blow from another lifetime. The noise of the lobby faded completely, leaving only the echo of that question suspended in the air between us. If you can feel the tension building and sense a deeper secret beneath the surface, comment 3 below. The truth waiting ahead is far bigger than I imagined. For a moment, I could not answer. My father's name had not been spoken aloud to me in decades, and hearing it in the middle of a luxury hotel lobby felt like the past had stepped forward and placed a hand on my shoulder. The older woman watched me carefully, her expression neither intrusive nor hurried, as though she understood that memory sometimes takes time to return. "Yes," I finally said, my voice thin. "Samuel Whitaker was my father." She nodded slowly, relief and sadness mingling in her eyes. She introduced herself as Mrs. Evelyn Price and explained that she had worked as house manager in my father's Charleston home for more than 25 years. Her voice carried the steady cadence of someone accustomed to responsibility and discretion. She studied my face with a quiet recognition that made my chest tighten. Before I could ask how she knew me, she said my father had left instructions before his death. If I ever appeared alone and in distress, she was to give me something he had entrusted to her care. The words "alone and in distress" lingered in the air between us, describing my present circumstance with uncomfortable precision. She excused herself briefly and disappeared behind a side door. The receptionist at the desk pretended to busy herself with paperwork, offering me privacy while I stood clutching the impossible bill. My hands still trembled, but the shock had begun to dull, replaced by a wary alertness. Mrs. Price returned holding a small envelope the color of old parchment. The edges were softened with age, the paper carefully preserved. My name was written across the front in fading ink. Seeing his handwriting after so many years made my throat tighten. I hesitated before taking it. Accepting the envelope felt like reopening a door I had closed long ago. Still, I reached for it, my fingers unsteady. Inside was a small brass key attached to a tag from a Charleston bank and a folded note written in my father's hand. I unfolded the paper slowly. "If you are reading this, Margaret, it means circumstances have turned against you. The truth about our family was never simple. Retrieve the documents in my safety deposit box. Trust carefully. What you find may place you in danger, but it will also protect what is rightfully yours." I read the note twice, the words rearranging everything I thought I knew. My father had always been a reserved man, distant and difficult to understand. After his death, unanswered questions lingered, but life had demanded my full attention. I had no time to search for truths buried beneath survival. The weight of the hotel bill returned to my awareness. I told Mrs. Price I could not accept help paying it. The sum was too large, the obligation too heavy. She shook her head gently and placed her hand over mine. She said my father once intervened when her own family faced eviction, arranging work and housing that allowed them to remain together. Helping his daughter, she insisted, was not charity, but gratitude fulfilled. Her expression grew more hesitant as she added that my son had visited the resort months earlier. He asked detailed questions about Samuel Whitaker's land holdings and whether any heirs remained. His interest, she said carefully, did not feel sentimental. The words settled into place with chilling clarity. The weekend had not been a gift. It had been a maneuver. Humiliation gave way to something steadier. Fear remained, but beneath it the current of resolve began to form. If Daniel believed there was something hidden in my father's past, then I needed to find it before he did. Mrs. Price urged me to go to the bank as soon as possible. Others, she warned, might be searching for the same truth. I closed my hand around the key, its cool metal pressing into my palm like a promise. Outside, the coastal wind struck my face, sharp with salt and change. The ocean no longer seemed peaceful. It looked vast and unknowable. I stepped forward into the brightness of the day, carrying a small key, and the uneasy certainty that my life had shifted from humiliation toward revelation. If you think the envelope was only the beginning and something far more dangerous is unfolding, comment 4 below. Let's step into the discovery that reshaped my past. The drive from the coast into downtown Charleston felt longer than the miles suggested. The wide coastal road narrowed into streets lined with live oaks and historic brick buildings, their iron balconies casting delicate shadows on the sidewalks below. Carriages rolled past to tourists with cameras, and church steeples rose above the skyline like quiet witnesses to centuries of change. I parked near the bank address printed on the brass tag and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the steering wheel, steadying my breathing before stepping out into the humid afternoon air. The bank stood on a corner framed by tall columns and dark wooden doors polished to a deep shine. It looked less like a financial institution and more like a courthouse, a place where decisions carried weight and permanence. Inside, the marble floor muffled footsteps, and the air felt cool and still. I approached the desk, presented my identification, and explained that I needed to access a safety deposit box. The clerk examined the key, then my face, with a quiet professionalism before asking me to sign several documents. A second employee escorted me through a secure door into the vault area. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the sound of the outer lobby vanished behind thick steel and concrete. Rows of metal boxes lined the walls in precise order. The attendant located the number attached to my key and slid the narrow drawer free, placing it on a small table before stepping away to provide privacy. I sat down slowly. For several seconds, I simply stared at the box, aware that whatever lay inside had waited decades for this moment. My fingers trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside were neatly stacked folders, sealed envelopes, and several rolled documents tied with thin cotton ribbon. The papers were arranged with deliberate care, as though someone had intended them to be understood in sequence. I unfolded the first document and found myself staring at a property deed bearing my father's name. More deeds followed. Parcel after parcel of coastal land appeared in official language and careful maps. Boundaries stretched across marshland, dunes, and oceanfront acreage. I had believed my father died with little to his name, yet here was proof that he once owned property that now formed part of the most valuable shoreline in the region. Beneath the deeds lay legal filings stamped with dates from decades earlier. They described rapid sales conducted under financial pressure, valuations disputed in hurried hearings, and agreements executed under circumstances that felt uncomfortably coercive. Letters attached to the filings referenced business partners and lenders demanding repayment schedules impossible to meet. Further down in the stack, corporate transfer records documented how the parcels had been absorbed into larger development projects over time. One company name appeared repeatedly, printed in formal typeface across multiple filings. I recognized it immediately. It was the real estate firm where Daniel worked. The realization settled over me with a cold clarity. This was not coincidence. Daniel knew what these documents represented. Near the bottom of the box, a sealed envelope contained affidavits naming me as a surviving heir. The language was precise and unmistakable. I retained legal standing regarding claims connected to these properties. Attached notes, written in my father's firm handwriting, urged preservation of the records and careful legal counsel should disputes arise. I sat back in the chair, the papers spread before me like fragments of a hidden history. My father had not been the simple, distant man I remembered. He had fought pressures I never knew existed, navigating a system that seemed determined to swallow him whole. His silence now felt less like indifference and more like containment. The figures referenced in the filings hinted at present values far beyond anything I could comprehend. Control of these records could influence claims worth millions. For the first time, I understood why Daniel would go to extraordinary lengths. I gathered the documents carefully, aware that I was no longer holding mere paperwork. I was carrying evidence of history, conflict, and responsibility. When I stepped back into the Charleston sunlight, the historic streets no longer looked quaint. They felt layered with unseen struggles, and I understood that I had stepped into a story far larger than my own. I stepped out of the bank clutching the folder against my chest, the thick paper edges pressing through the thin fabric of my blouse. The late afternoon heat had settled over Charleston, carrying the scent of warm brick and tidal marsh. Traffic moved steadily along the street, yet I felt strangely exposed, as though I were carrying something visible to everyone but me. I had just reached the curb when a familiar voice called my name. Daniel stood a few yards away, his posture straight, his expression composed in a way that felt practiced rather than natural. Vanessa lingered behind him, one hand resting lightly on her handbag, her face calm and unreadable. The sight of them together, waiting as if they had known exactly when I would emerge, tightened something deep in my chest. He asked if we could talk for a moment. His tone was even, stripped of the warmth he had used at the resort. There was no trace of the sun who once clung to my hand while crossing busy streets. I nodded, unable to summon words. He glanced at the folder I held and confirmed that he knew about the safety deposit box. He spoke quickly, explaining that the coastal parcels referenced in the documents were now worth tens of millions of dollars. Development negotiations, he said, had stalled because ownership claims remained unresolved. If I transferred my interest to him, the process could move forward without legal complications. He described the matter as a practical decision. Litigation, he warned, could drag on for years and exhaust me financially and emotionally. He assured me he could manage everything efficiently, shielding me from stress. Vanessa's voice entered the conversation with calm precision. She explained that the incident at the resort had been meant to demonstrate financial vulnerability, a way to show how fragile my position truly was. Dependence, she suggested, would have made cooperation easier. Her tone carried no apology, only clinical reasoning, as though she were describing a business strategy rather than an act of cruelty. The words settled over me with a cold clarity. The humiliation in the lobby had not been an impulsive cruelty. It had been calculated. I looked at Daniel and searched for the boy I had raised, the child who once cried over torn sneakers and whispered his fears in the dark. What I saw instead was a man shaped by ambition and resentment, convinced that hardship justified any method of escape. Before I could respond, a man approached from the bank entrance. He introduced himself as a civil rights attorney representing descendants of families displaced from coastal land decades earlier. He spoke respectfully, but his presence carried quiet authority. He explained that several of the transactions connected to Samuel Whitaker had long been contested, and that the documents I held could reopen historical claims involving generational injustice. Daniel's jaw tightened. He argued that the past had already been settled and that reopening it would benefit no one. The attorney responded that unresolved history rarely remains buried and that justice delayed does not erase harm. I felt the weight of their words pressing against the folder in my arms. This decision was no longer about inheritance alone. It touched history, responsibility, and the lives of people I had never met. Daniel insisted he deserved the wealth after growing up with scarcity. He framed his actions as reclaiming what should have belonged to him all along. I heard the bitterness beneath his reasoning, and recognized the quiet resentments I had failed to see. Love for my son pulled against something steadier rising within me. I imagined years of court proceedings, public scrutiny, and the exhaustion of conflict, yet I also knew that surrendering these documents would bury truths that deserved light. I told him I needed time. The words felt small against the magnitude of what stood before us, but they were all I could offer. Vanessa watched silently. The attorney handed me a card with discreet restraint. I walked away without looking back, gripping the folder more tightly. Each step felt heavier than the last, and I understood that whatever choice I made next would define not only the future of this land, but the person I would become. If you're still here and wondering how far betrayal and greed can really go, comment 6 below. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7, where the consequences begin to surface. I walked several blocks before I realized I had no memory of crossing the streets between the bank and my car. The folder pressed against my chest like a second heartbeat, its weight both literal and symbolic. Traffic moved, horns sounded, and pedestrians passed, yet everything felt distant, as though I were moving through a muted version of the world. By the time I reached my apartment in North Charleston, the sun had begun to sink behind the low rooftops, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I climbed the stairs slowly, my legs heavy from more than physical fatigue. Inside, the familiar scent of laundry soap and old wood greeted me. Nothing had changed in the 2 days I had been gone, yet everything felt altered. I placed the folder on the kitchen table and sat across from it without turning on the lights. The room dimmed into soft gray as evening settled. My hands rested in my lap, still as if movement might disturb the fragile order of my thoughts. Grief arrived first. It came quietly, not as tears, but as a deep ache behind my ribs. I mourned the son I believed I had raised, the boy who once pressed his forehead to mine when he was afraid of thunderstorms. I replayed the lobby scene at the resort, his calm expression, the folded bill in my hand, and Vanessa's measured explanation outside the bank. The cruelty had not been impulsive. It had been designed. I opened the folder again, spreading the documents across the table. Legal language filled the pages, but beneath the formal phrasing I began to see patterns. Letters from lenders pressed my father for accelerated payments. Notes referenced partners threatening litigation. One handwritten page in his steady script documented meetings that ended without agreement, followed by abrupt transfers that suggested coercion rather than choice. For the first time, I considered that Samuel Whitaker may not have surrendered his land willingly. The man I remembered as distant and silent might have been carrying burdens he believed he could not share. Silence, I realized, can conceal struggle as easily as indifference. The television murmured in the background after I switched it on for company. A local news segment mentioned renewed attention to historical coastal land transfers and possible legal challenges tied to decades-old disputes. The anchor spoke in careful tones about community impact and economic implications. Hearing the story framed in public language made my private turmoil feel suddenly exposed. An envelope slid beneath my door sometime after dark. I found it on the floor when I went to lock the deadbolt. Inside was a letter from a law firm representing Daniel. The language was precise and cold, questioning my capacity to manage complex financial matters and suggesting the appointment of a guardian if I refused cooperation. The words were legal, but the intention behind them felt deeply personal. I sat at the table again, the letter beside my father's documents. Anger flickered briefly, then settled into something steadier. Daniel's urgency was no longer only ambition. It was fear of losing position, of corporate scrutiny, of consequences he could not control. I began organizing the papers into careful stacks, labeling dates and names on a notepad. The act of sorting brought a sense of order to the chaos inside me. I found myself making timelines, cross-referencing notes, and marking questions for further research. With each small act, my breathing steadied. Outside, the street grew quiet. A porch light flickered across the pavement, and a stray cat moved along the curb with cautious purpose. I stood at the window watching the stillness settle over the neighborhood. I understood then that I might lose my son no matter what I chose. The realization did not shatter me as I expected. Instead, it clarified something essential. Dignity sometimes requires standing alone. The past no longer felt like a weight pressing me down. It felt like a responsibility placed carefully in my hands. I woke before dawn, unsure whether I had truly slept or simply drifted in and out of restless thought. The apartment felt unusually still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table with my notes spread before me, the neat columns of dates and names offering a fragile sense of order. The exhaustion from the day before remained in my bones, yet beneath it lay something steadier. The paralysis that had gripped me was loosening its hold. After the first cup, I dialed the number on the card the attorney had given me outside the bank. My voice sounded calm, almost detached, as I asked to schedule a meeting. I told him I wanted a full review of the historical claims connected to the land. Speaking the words aloud made the situation feel larger than inheritance. This was no longer a private matter between a mother and her son. By mid-morning, I found myself inside the county records office, a quiet building that smelled faintly of paper and dust. Metal shelves held bound ledgers, and maps rolled into narrow tubes. A clerk directed me to archived property records, and I spent hours turning fragile pages, tracing boundary lines drawn decades ago. Names appeared repeatedly, followed by abrupt transfers and legal notations indicating disputes resolved under financial duress. In another file, I found testimony from families forced to relinquish coastal parcels after failing to meet revised loan terms. The language was formal, but the stories beneath it spoke of displacement, lost livelihoods, and futures redirected without consent. As I read, I recognized echoes of the pressure documented in my father's notes. The line between victim and participant blurred, replaced by a history shaped by forces larger than any single person. My phone vibrated several times in my purse. When I finally checked it, there were multiple voicemails from Daniel. His tone shifted from persuasive to urgent, warning that delays could jeopardize development agreements and invite costly litigation. I did not return the calls. Silence, I realized, could be a boundary as firm as any spoken refusal. Later that afternoon, the attorney shared new information. Vanessa had contacted senior executives at Daniel's company, positioning herself as cooperative and forward-looking should legal complications escalate. The implication was clear. She intended to protect her standing regardless of Daniel's fate. The revelation did not shock me. It clarified the ambitions moving beneath the surface, revealing how quickly alliances fracture when security is threatened. I felt sorrow rather than anger. Greed, I was beginning to understand, does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers practical justifications until compassion erodes. I authorized the attorney to review all documents and proceed with reopening the historical claims. The decision felt less like defiance and more like alignment with something honest. My father's secrecy would not continue through me. As evening approached, I walked along the Charleston waterfront. The harbor reflected the fading light in rippling bands of gold and gray. Ships moved slowly across the horizon, and the air carried the mingled scents of salt and diesel. I paused at the railing and watched the tide shift, thinking of the generations whose lives had been shaped by this shoreline. Justice, I understood, might come at a personal cost. Yet, for the first time since the hotel lobby, I felt grounded rather than afraid. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was no longer hidden. If you believe truth always comes with a price and want to see how this story ends, comment 8 below. Let's move toward the final outcome together. The courthouse stood in the historic district like a structure rooted in permanence, its stone facade warmed by the morning sun and framed by tall windows that reflected the pale blue sky. I arrived early, carrying my folder in a canvas bag and a calm I would not have believed possible only days before. The air was humid and still, yet inside the building everything felt cool and measured, as though time moved differently within its walls. The hearing room filled slowly. My attorney greeted me with a quiet nod before arranging documents across the polished table. Representatives from the development firm sat on one side, their expressions carefully neutral. Several families occupied the back rows, their presence dignified and watchful rather than confrontational. Daniel entered a few minutes later, his suit wrinkled, his face drawn and pale. He avoided my eyes as he took his seat. Vanessa arrived shortly after and chose a chair at the far end, separated from him by an empty space that spoke more clearly than words. As the proceedings began, the attorneys reviewed decades-old land transfers and financial records. Maps were displayed, and the documents from my father's safety deposit box were entered into evidence. The language was formal and deliberate, yet beneath it lay stories of families displaced and livelihoods undone. I listened without interruption, absorbing the weight of testimony that stretched across generations. The court acknowledged that inequitable transactions and financial coercion had contributed to the loss of property held by local families. A framework for restitution was presented, including the creation of a community land trust and financial compensation for descendants. The tone in the room shifted from adversarial to solemn, as though the acknowledgement itself carried its own gravity. When my role was addressed, the judge recognized that my cooperation had made resolution possible. I retained lawful rights to the remaining interests, yet I declined any aggressive financial claim beyond what was necessary to finalize the settlement. The decision felt less like sacrifice and more like alignment with something fair. Corporate counsel then addressed Daniel's conduct, citing evidence of attempted manipulation of inheritance control. An internal review, they stated, had concluded earlier that morning. His position had been terminated. Daniel sat motionless, his shoulders rigid, as if the words had drained the air from his lungs. Vanessa remained composed, speaking briefly with the corporate representatives and signaling her willingness to cooperate moving forward. The distance between them widened into something final. After the agreements were signed, representatives from several families approached to thank me. Their gratitude was quiet and restrained, offered with steady eye contact rather than ceremony. I felt humbled, aware that I had merely opened a door long closed. When I stepped outside, sunlight flooded the steps, and faint church bells carried across the square. I did not feel victorious. I felt relieved and deeply aware of what had been lost. Justice, I realized, rarely arrives as triumph. It arrives as balance restored, leaving silence where conflict once stood. Several months have passed since the hearing, and life has settled into a quieter rhythm. My apartment in North Charleston remains unchanged. The narrow kitchen, the small table by the window, the hum of the refrigerator that fills the silence at night. Yet the weight I once carried inside these walls has lifted. Morning coffee tastes the same, but I no longer drink it with the heaviness of unanswered questions pressing against my chest. The Community Land Trust has begun its work along the coast. Families who once feared displacement now attend planning meetings with cautious optimism. Repairs have started on aging homes, and small businesses are reopening along streets that had slowly emptied over the years. My name appears occasionally in local coverage, but I do not attend gatherings seeking recognition. I sit quietly in meetings when invited, ensuring records remain transparent and decisions documented. I am not a savior. I am a witness to truth finally spoken. I visited the Charleston Harbor last week, standing near the water where my father once conducted business I never understood. For years, I believed his silence meant indifference. Now, I see it may have been the burden of pressures he could not explain. I do not excuse his secrecy, but I no longer carry anger toward it. Acceptance has replaced judgment, and with it comes a gentler understanding of human frailty. I have not spoken to Daniel since the day the court adjourned. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that he relocated inland and is searching for new work. The knowledge stirred something tender but no longer destructive. I still love my son. That truth remains. Yet I have learned that love cannot require surrendering one's dignity. Vanessa remained with the firm and advanced quickly. I do not resent her ambition. Fear and survival shape people in different ways. Last weekend, I walked along the shoreline near the resort island. The waves moved in the same steady rhythm, but I felt different standing there. The place that marked my deepest humiliation had become the beginning of clarity. The key placed in my hand opened more than a safety deposit box. It unlocked buried truths and the courage to face them. I inherited not wealth, but responsibility, and in honoring it, I found my own voice. As the tide receded and returned, I turned toward home, lighter than I have felt in decades. When truth finally rises to the surface, it rarely arrives gently. It comes with the weight of history, the echo of difficult choices, and the quiet understanding that justice is not about winning, but about restoring balance. Some inherit wealth, others inherit silence, but the greatest inheritance is the courage to face what was hidden and choose integrity over comfort. The past cannot be rewritten, yet it can be acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement lies the power to heal wounds carried across generations. Dignity is not found in what we possess, but in what we protect, when it would be easier to turn away. And sometimes, the most profound freedom comes not from reclaiming what was lost, but from refusing to repeat the harms that caused the loss in the first place. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story moved you, share your thoughts in the comments, and consider following and subscribing for more reflections like this.